Good morning. Today I'm going to speak, or rather, going to explore an interpretation of the nature of light. And to begin this, I'm going to just summarize a universal pattern that I've written about and spoken about over the last few years. And this ubiquitous pattern is very well represented across the sands of time by this emergence of a flower from a seed. So if we think about a seed, stalk, and then flower, and refer to these as the physical, vital, mental, we see that there's an increase in the degrees of freedom as this emergence happens through time. And we find this pattern across history and across geography in many, many, many different realms. And that really begs the question as to what is it about our system whereby this universal pattern appears regardless of time and regardless of space. And this leads us to a suggestion that there's a set of fundamental properties about a system that allow this pattern to emerge. And so if we think about these properties, we may refer to them as something whereby no matter what area we're looking at, where in geography we find the same thing occurring. So there's a system presence, or perhaps an omnipresence, whereby wherever this pattern can emerge, it will. There's a system power, or perhaps an omnipotence, because we know that as we move from one level of maturity to the next, there's tremendous opposition or resistance to that change. In spite of that, the change happens, which suggests that the system that we live in has this incredible innate power to it. We have this notion of system knowledge, or perhaps omniscience, because circumstances, instruments are leveraged to bring about this change in maturity. And we have this notion of system nurturing, or perhaps omniloving, because there's no reason why the system should even bother about increasing our maturity and increasing our degrees of freedom unless there was an implicit love whereby everything matures to a high degree of fulfillment. And so we have these four overarching properties of our system, if you will. The question is, how do these manifest around us in time? So if we consider the whole range of different distances in the universe, so from 10 to the minus 35 meters to 10 to the power 26 meters, so that's 60 orders of magnitude. And if you look at the middle point, which is about 10 to the minus 6 meters, so that's a cell, then we see that the question is, do these four kind of patterns or principles emerge no matter where we look at in our universe? And so when we think about a cell, we see that proteins emulate this notion of presence. There's about 30,000 proteins in the human cell, for instance, that diligently, with perseverance, create a lot of possibility within each and every living cell. And we have this notion of power through the molecular plan of polysaccharides. Similarly, we have this notion of knowledge in a cell through the molecular plan of nucleic acids, and we have this notion of love or nurturing through the molecular plan of lipids. And these are four fundamental molecular plans that exist in every living cell. And so we see that in some sense this is reflected certainly at the cellular level. And if we step back to a smaller scale at the atomic level, we'll see that this notion of omnipresence is reflected in a fundamental implicit structure of atoms, and in particular the d orbital reflects this notion of presence. This notion of power is reflected by the s orbital, this notion of knowledge by the p orbital, and this notion of loving by the f orbital. So we see that even within atoms and the periodic table, and the way that the periodic table is structured, we have these four fundamental groupings of the d orbital, s orbital, p orbital, f orbital that are precipitations in some sense of these underlying or pervasive system properties. But if we go back to the quantum level, we see again that the notion of presence is perhaps reflected by the Higgs boson, the notion of power by the group of fundamental quantum particles called leptons, system knowledge by quarks, and the notion of connection or loving by bosons. And so we find the same set of the four principles occurring at 10 to the minus 35 meters. And if we think about getting to the larger scale, so we've already covered 30 orders of magnitude here between the quantum level and the cellular level. But if we think about the electromagnetic spectrum, which pervades everything, we see that its ability to generate mass is reflective of this notion of system presence. The notion of system power is implicit in the energy gradient that exists in the electromagnetic spectrum. The notion of system knowledge is implicit also in the electromagnetic spectrum through the different archetypes of wavelength and frequency, from gamma rays to radio waves and so on. And we see that this notion of loving or nurturing is reflected with the speed with which the electromagnetic spectrum moves, and which I had talked about previously over the last few weeks, which leads us to this notion of light. So when we consider light, the electromagnetic spectrum is perhaps an instance of light. But if we consider light by itself, it too has four aspects to it. So there's certainly, through the finiteness of the speed of light, which exists in our known universe, we have this implicit principle of presence set up by the past, because there's a stabilization factor where we begin to see everything that exists around us by result of past work. We have this notion of implicit notion of power or potence through the present, where there's a movement of various different kinds of forces and energies vying for expression. And we have this notion of knowledge through the future, so everything going towards some kind of maturity. And then we have this notion of nurturing or loving through the implicit power of connection that a finite speed of light exercises as different isolated islands of matter are connected together. And we know that these four properties, if you will, are a function of a finite speed of light that we know as c, 186,000 miles per second. But we've also argued that if we were to increase the speed of light to infinite, we in fact emerge with a system that's reflected in these four overarching qualities, because we're saying that there's an intelligence, a loving, all-present, all-knowing intelligence that is implicit in our system and knows the system, obviously, by notion of its omniscience, loves the system completely, moves the system towards higher and higher degrees of maturity. And this can only happen if C is infinite, because if C is infinite, then past, present, future merge and everything is known to that thing that's moving at infinite speed. And then we had also argued that at some speed, let's call it c to the base n, that lies closer to c but further away from infinite, there's behavior, or there's a kind of a reality that's created that's more wave-like. And we can argue that at ck, where there's a bigger distance, or the speed of light is much greater than c but less than c infinite, we basically have more of the existence of fields. And so when we look at this, for potentially different speeds of light, which are of course hypothetical, then we have particles, a total immersion at infinite, waves and fields, and the proposition is that this all exists together. And then further, through the very way in which light moves, we have this whole fourfold set of properties that pervades our known universe in these sets of four. And an interpretation is that light is, therefore everything is a manifestation of light. Light is everything, everything exists within light, and it manifests in these different tangible ways that we can experience, but perhaps there's also a lot more implicit in it that we have yet to discover.